Daisy had been spotting a stray Labrador in the park for several days, and it soon became clear to her that this dog was alone and in need of help. The large, furry dog was friendly but cautious, always accepting food and water but keeping his distance. Despite the fact that no one seemed to know where he came from, Daisy felt compelled to help him, and she began bringing him food every day. She couldn't help but wonder why such a well-behaved dog was out there all alone. As the days passed, Daisy couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The dog had been alone for a while, but his cautious behavior made her wonder if he had escaped from an abusive or neglectful home. Unlike the happy, playful dogs she was used to, this dog wouldn't trust anyone and wouldn't approach humans unless they kept their distance. His reluctance to trust made Daisy even more determined to help him, so she continued to feed him and hoped that over time, he would open up. After several days without anyone coming forward to claim the dog, Daisy decided to take action. She called animal services for help, but when they informed her that they would take the dog to a shelter, she quickly hung up. She was horrified to learn that dogs left in shelters would be euthanized if not adopted within a short period. Refusing to let that happen, Daisy decided to handle it on her own. Though many of her neighbors had lost interest, Daisy kept visiting the park to care for the dog. Over time, she grew increasingly fond of him, and eventually she spoke with her husband about adopting the dog. He agreed, and they were both excited about giving him a better life. However, before they could bring the dog home, they needed to catch him first. Daisy and her husband bought some food, toys, and treats, hoping to entice the dog. When they arrived at the park, the dog seemed to recognize them and approached without hesitation, eager to see what they had brought. Daisy couldn't believe it, he was coming to her. She was thrilled that the dog was finally starting to trust her, but she knew she had to take things slow. Daisy placed the food on the ground and gave the dog space as she always had, but this time she stayed nearby. The dog was initially tense, but when Daisy called him in a soft, gentle voice, he slowly moved toward her. Despite his hesitation, he was too hungry to ignore the food, and he finally ate. Afterward, Daisy reached out to pet him. That's when she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a collar around his neck. At first, Daisy felt a wave of disappointment. Perhaps the dog wasn't really a stray after all, and he had a home to return to. But as she examined the collar, she realized it had a strange tag. Instead of an ID with a name or phone number, it had a username, password, and coordinates. Daisy was baffled. What did this mean? She showed the collar to her husband, and they decided to follow the coordinates, hoping it would lead them to some answers. They drove to the address, a quiet, industrial part of town. The houses appeared abandoned, and the whole area felt unsettling. But they pressed on, determined to understand the mystery. When they reached the location, Daisy and her husband parked and approached the house. John went up to knock, but there was no answer. He looked through a window, then turned to tell Daisy something, but she couldn't hear him. As she rolled down the window to listen, the dog jumped from the back seat, out the window, and ran straight to the house. John watched in disbelief as the dog darted through a broken window, and before he could do anything, Daisy and John rushed to follow him. They called out but heard only the dog's barks echoing in the empty house. As they investigated the back, they noticed a door slightly ajar. Hesitantly, they entered. Inside, it was clear the house had been abandoned for years. The lower level was empty and there was no sign of anyone living there. But as they ascended the stairs, they heard the dog barking. When they entered a bedroom, they were shocked to find the dog lying on a bed next to a frail, elderly man. He looked weak and disoriented, and at first, he didn't seem to notice them. Eventually, the man acknowledged them, and they learned that he had been living in the house for years, ever since the previous owners had abandoned it. He explained that the dog, Jacko, had been left behind with the house. The man had taken in the dog as a companion, and over time, they had formed a bond. However, the man's health had deteriorated, and he knew he didn't have long left. He had sent Jacko to the park with the hope that someone would take him in and give him a better life. The elderly man's story left Daisy and John speechless. They offered to take him to the hospital, but he refused. His final wish was for them to adopt Jacko and care for him. The couple, deeply moved by the man's words, promised they would look after the dog. As they said their goodbyes, the elderly man's face lit up with relief, knowing Jacko would be in good hands. Daisy and John left the house in a daze. They had come there hoping to solve the mystery of the stray dog, but what they found was much more than they expected. It was a bittersweet moment, but they knew they had done the right thing. They would adopt Jacko, and he would have a loving home. The couple left with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that they had made a real difference in this dog's life.